Did you know that Saint John of the Cross, a man who emerged from poverty, endured exile, misunderstanding, and imprisonment, is called the Doctor of Mysticism? He left behind works that have shaken Christian spirituality for centuries. A spiritual friend of Saint Teresa of Ávila, the great theologian who, together with her, reformed the Carmelite family. Saint John produced many poems rich in mystical character and theological insight, emphasizing the purification of the soul. The flame bearing John's name turned dark days into the dark night, transformed the ascetic journey into the ascent of Mount Carmel, and changed the lonely soul into the living flame of love. Before we begin, let us know where in the world you are from in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel to watch more moving stories about the saints. What caused a boy born amid the poverty of Fontiveros to become the mystical doctor of the Church? That question opens like a doorway into the early years of John of the Cross, where poverty and hardship were not a darkness covering life, but became the first point of contact with grace. Looking back, we're startled to realize that it was precisely deprivation, rejection, and the tears of a wandering mother that cleared the path for a child's heart to begin tasting the mystery of the cross. In the unsteady steps of a young child, God planted a seed of silence that would one day bloom into a whole mystical forest, sustaining his religious life. John was born in 1542 inches, Fontiveros, a small village in Castile. From his earliest days, his family suffered a painful blow when his father, Gonzalo de Yepes, was rejected by his noble family for having married Catalina, a poor, widowed woman. That exclusion cut the family off from every material and emotional support they might have received, and poverty became a persistent companion. When Gonzalo died, the burden suddenly fell on the thin shoulders of a solitary mother. The family had to leave their birthplace and wander to Medina del Campo in search of daily bread. Each step of those small travelers was marked by weariness, but also upheld by the resilience of a mother raising her children amid countless trials. Amid poverty and uncertainty, John was not overwhelmed. Instead, he grew with a remarkably sensitive heart toward the suffering of others. As a very young man, he worked at the Conception Hospital, which housed the insane, the dying, and those forgotten by society. While many recoiled from such misery, John saw something else there. Empty eyes, bodies in pain, and cries that no one answered became a summons from the Invisible One. He realized that God did not stand far from humanity, but hid within wounds that seemed meaningless. In a space heavy with the smell of sickness, he sensed the gentle fragrance of mercy quietly at work. Grace did not come to him like a lightning strike, but like water seeping into soil. During long hours of work, as he cleaned the wounds of the dying or steadied a patient in panic, John felt his heart widen. Instead of fear or discouragement, he was moved by a tenderness he himself could not explain. That hospital, which many avoided, became the first school teaching him about God's presence in what appears to be failure and suffering. And there, the seed of vocation began to glow, even though he didn't yet understand it. Growing up in poverty, John's soul was shaped by three deep rhythms. The first was poverty itself, which surrounded his life as an unavoidable reality, yet opened his heart to compassion. The second was silence, the silence of nights when his mother cried because she didn't know what tomorrow would hold, or the silence of the hospital where he listened to others' pain. The third was mercy, the nameless mercy that drew him to bend toward those the world had abandoned. These rhythms wove together into a strong inner foundation that John would later describe with mystical imagery in the dark night and the living flame of love. Though life remained filled with trials, deep within, he always sensed a gentle yet persistent call. That call did not come from human voices, but from the movement of the Spirit in his heart, a call inviting him to step beyond his own poverty and enter a radical encounter with God. And as with every life touched by God, that call did not remain only an intuition. It was preparing to lead John into a turning point that would change everything. opening a new path where light is not something seen with the eyes, but something recognized by the heart. That path was bringing him toward an important decision of youth, a decision that would lead John into the very depths of the light. How could a young man who had just stepped out from the shadows of the human world choose the narrowest and most austere path, the Carmelite way? That question echoed like a voice rising from the silence of Castile, where John, after years of living among poverty and hospitals, was searching for a direction for his life. There were wide roads before him, opportunities a bright and diligent young man could easily grasp. Yet in the depths of his soul, another call rose with greater force, a call inviting John to enter a path of fire and silence, where God is not understood first by reason, but recognized by a heart made pure. The Jesuit school in Medina del Campo had opened for John the door of knowledge. He studied the humanities, rhetoric, and classical languages with impressive diligence. People saw before him a promising future, perhaps as a scholar, a teacher, or at least someone held in esteem by society. Yet the light of learning was still not enough to warm the burning spiritual thirst within him. Each time he left class and stepped into the quiet of the afternoon, John felt a vague emptiness. His heart wrestled between two directions, one laid out by human design, the other quietly stirred by God. On nights when he sat with his books, the small flickering lamp on his desk sometimes seemed to reflect another kind of light, deeper and more mysterious. In those moments, John felt the greatest struggle of youth, between what the eyes could see and what the heart perceived. Those of his time saw a literary or philosophical future opening before him. But he himself heard another whispering voice, inviting him to abandon all plans and enter a small, hidden, even harsh path. And he chose what few would choose. In 1563, John decided to enter the Carmelite Order and took the name Juan de San Matia. It was not an impulsive decision, nor a rejection of knowledge, but a mission God was quietly guiding. The moment he crossed the threshold of the novitiate, John sensed a clear change. The strict ascetic life, the long hours of prayer, the silence enveloping the monastery poured into his heart, a peace he had never known before. Leaving the novitiate, John continued his studies at the University of Salamanca for about 3 years. There he delved into philosophy and theology, not to accumulate knowledge for himself, but to prepare for a greater path of service. The writings of the Church Fathers, hours of analyzing Scripture, and lectures on the mystery of the Trinity illuminated his mind. On nights of study, when everyone else had gone to sleep, John often remained long beside the candle. A spiritual awareness grew in him, as though God drew near through each line, each meditation. He sensed God as fire, a fire that does not consume the body, but causes the soul to unfold in fullness. In the atmosphere of Salamanca, John's inner life took clear shape. The Carmelite ascetic lifestyle, the steady rhythm of prayer and the quiet that filled the classrooms, all wove together into a firm foundation for his future journey. 3 steps of preparation for the mission were etched into him: prayer to listen to God's voice, asceticism to purify oneself, and interior light to discern the right path. Those years did not turn him into a mere scholar, but made him an instrument God was sharpening for a greater mission, one beyond human calculation. Gradually, every detail of monastic life became an echo of a larger reality. He understood that silence is where God speaks most strongly, asceticism is where love becomes pure, and knowledge becomes true light only when placed under the guidance of grace. All these things prepared a foundation for John that would later become the core of the reformed Carmelite spirituality. But God was not only preparing John's heart for religious life, he was also preparing him for a decisive encounter. A meeting that would change not only John's life, but the face of Spanish spiritual life as well. At the end of the road in Salamanca, another flame was drawing near, the flame named Teresa, who would join John in writing the burning story of Carmelite reform. To learn more about Saint Teresa of Ávila, you may read the article about her life. I have placed the link right below. What happens when two souls set aflame by the same God meet? That question cuts through the darkness of the age like a streak of light, opening the decisive moment when Teresa of Jesus, the woman of fire, encountered John, the man of the dark night. It was a meeting without the appearance of great external events, yet it became the starting point of a deep renewal within Spanish religious life. Both carried in their hearts a shared desire, the desire to restore to the Carmelite Order the purity of holiness that time had dimmed. The backdrop to that meeting was not a period of clarity in religious life, but a time when the Carmelite Order was falling into a decline that troubled many souls. The original rule had gradually been relaxed, austerity diminished, and community life had blended with the easy spirit of the age. Signs of lukewarmness spread throughout the monasteries, causing pain to those who loved the spiritual life. Teresa of Jesus, who had undergone a powerful conversion, saw this deterioration with a grieving heart. She understood that unless the order returned to its source, the spirit would struggle to kindle new flames. Yet to begin such a great reform, Teresa needed someone to support her, a soul capable of living in silence while remaining steadfast, someone humble enough to be hidden and strong enough to stand firm in storms. In 1567, at Medina del Campo, destiny touched the paths of the two. Teresa arrived with a burning desire, and John arrived with an inner call he was still trying to understand. When they met, that call seemed to become instantly clear. Teresa presented her reform plan, a plan to restore the order to the simplicity, austerity, and prayer of its beginnings. Her words came from a heart consumed by the love of God, and that very heat made John recognize at once what he had been waiting for. In her eyes, he did not see someone merely seeking to restore order to the rule, but a soul blazing with the desire for union with God. In her, he recognized the familiar voice of grace he had experienced during long nights in Salamanca. Teresa perceived the same. She saw in John a silence that came not from timidity, but from inner depth. She saw in him an ability to endure, a spiritual intuition, and a heart forged in the fire of poverty. The meeting did not last long, yet it was enough for both to look in the same direction. They understood that to reform the Carmelites meant facing countless trials, but they believed the work belonged to God, so nothing could hinder it. From that encounter, a new journey began. Only a short time later, on the 28th of December 1568, the first reformed Carmelite monastery at Duruelo was officially established. The place was so poor that no one thought monks could survive there, yet it was precisely in poverty that the first flame of the reform blazed strongly. John chose to live within those humble earthen walls, and there he changed his name to John of the Cross. The change of name was not to create an impression, but to express his intention to unite himself fully with the mystery of the cross, the mystery that would become the axis of his entire spiritual life. The monastery at Duruelo was not a grand structure, but a space sanctified by God from the beginning. The monks lived in absolute poverty, practiced harsh austerity, slept little, and prayed much. The three rhythms of the reform were clearly established: poverty as the foundation, discipline as the pillar, and inner purity as the strength keeping religious life oriented toward God. Together with Teresa, John became a landmark of the order, not because of talent or position, but because his very life reflected the light of the one he served. Their collaboration was not always smooth. They came from two different personalities, yet they shared one fire and one direction. Their differences enriched their common work. The letters Teresa later sent John show her respect for his silence, and John drew from her advice as from a spring of clear water. The two were like different rhythms of the same song, a song God was writing for the Carmelite Order. Yet every flame that rises must face contrary winds. The reform stirred not only zeal, but also touched sensitive areas for many. These changes began to unsettle the community and provoked fierce reactions. For John, These trials would open the darkest chapter of his life, a time when interior light had to stand firm against the harshness of reality. And as Duruelo began to shine as a hopeful beginning, God was preparing John for another path, a path that would test him to the very end. One door was slowly closing, and the door of the Toledo prison was opening before him. How could a person who was beaten, locked in a dark cell, cold and hungry, and humiliated by his own brothers write the most beautiful verses of Christian poetry? That question pierced like a blade into the brutal context John of the Cross had to face in 1577, a time when the flame of reform had only begun to rise, and the darkness of opposition had already descended. Hidden behind the wall of that conflict was not only internal discord, but a battle between humanity and grace, between visible violence and the invisible light growing within John's soul. In 1577, the tensions surrounding the reform became fierce. A group of friars who followed the old way of life decided to crush John's resolve by kidnapping him and taking him to the prison in Toledo. The iron door shutting behind him was the moment a dark atmosphere fell over his life, like a night with no dawn. John was locked in a cramped cell, lacking light, air, and even the minimal respect due to a human being. Each day, they shackled him, beat him, shouted at him, and starved him to force him to abandon the path of reform. On nights when the wind slipped through the cold cracks of the wall, he shivered under a thin, torn cloak, yet that solitude became the ground from which unexpected spiritual light would rise. In the thick darkness of the cell, it seemed every means of survival had been stripped away. But precisely when his body was exhausted and his mind besieged, John heard another resonance, clearer than all the noise of the world. Instead of resentment or fear, his soul opened to God in complete silence. They thought imprisoning him in darkness would extinguish the flame of reform, but in that place without light, John began to experience a brightness stronger than any earthly lamp. God entered his soul in the purest form of love, a love that needed no words, yet had the power to transform. The deeper he was pushed into suffering, the more John felt that God was using the trial to refine him. Each wound and each humiliation became a quiet tapping of the Spirit, preparing the way for intense union. Who could have imagined that a man exhausted, bound and afflicted could hear God's voice so clearly? He recognized God in every weak breath, in every moment that seemed close to despair. Solitude became a place of encounter. Darkness became the shelter of grace, and suffering became an invitation to enter the depths of mystery. And then, in the midst of imprisonment, John began to write. He wrote, not with elegant ink, but with the memory of a soul warmed by God's presence. Each line of the spiritual canticle was born under conditions no one would believe could give rise to a hymn of divine love. Those verses did not record anger or complaint, but drew the deep longing of a soul seeking God. They took away his light, but they could not take from him the inner radiance the Spirit was kindling day by day. While his body was pushed to the edge, John's soul rose with the strength of one who surrendered completely. After 9 months of imprisonment, when both his strength and dignity had been tested to the limit, John decided to escape. On the night of 16 to the dawn of 17 August 1578, he tied together strips of bed linen to form a rope and used it to climb down into the courtyard. That escape did not bear the marks of rebellion, but stood as a symbol of a soul reaching toward freedom to continue the mission God had entrusted. When he stepped beyond the thick wall, John was extremely weak. He dragged his feet through the night, not knowing where he was going, until a dog appeared and led him into the city. No one could explain that appearance, but many saw it as a sign of God's protection. John sought out the Carmelite nuns' monastery, where the sisters cared for him. There, he recovered and began reading aloud the verses he had written in prison. Those lines, chilled with pain yet blazing with the love of God, touched the hearts of the sisters like an unfamiliar beam of light. From the deepest darkness, John emerged with the strongest light. It was in prison that he learned what years of study could not give, the absolute union with God in every circumstance. Stepping out of the dungeon, John did not break. On the contrary, God prepared him for the most radiant period of his life, the period that would transform the sufferings of his imprisonment into the great mystical writings of the Church, where inner light becomes a guide leading souls into the depths of God. What allows a monk who had been pushed to the limits of suffering to write the deepest theological pages on the purification of the soul? How could someone who had just emerged from the darkness of the Toledo prison, his body still marked by wounds, present the mystery of the dark night with a clarity admired even by the scholars of his time? To answer that, we must return to the very question that once tightened within John's heart. Why does God lead the soul into darkness? Why does silence, dryness, and trials become the path that leads to light? The months in the Toledo prison not only tested his body and mind, but also opened in John a deeper doorway into the spiritual life. When he stepped out from behind those walls, the question about the meaning of darkness clung to him like a summons. Anyone can see suffering, but very few can see God's presence in suffering. When John began to write, he did not try to describe his experience as a tragic tale, but used that very pain to illuminate the deep movements within the soul. 3 questions echoed throughout his contemplative life. Why does God allow the soul to enter darkness? Why do silence and dryness arrive at the moment one seems most in need of consolation, and for whom is that suffering intended? These were not protests against harshness, but an effort to seek the spiritual meaning hidden beneath events that seemed unreasonable. Precisely by entering the darkness, John realized that God was not standing at a distance observing, but was acting in silence in a way beyond human perception. From those questions, grace made a great discovery for John. He understood that the dark night is not the absence of God, but a presence so intense that an unpurified soul cannot yet perceive it fully. Like human eyes looking at the sun, the soul encountering the pure light of God enters a temporary blindness, a state both painful and necessary. The dark night is not the extinguishing of light, but a light so radiant it becomes darkness to one who is not yet accustomed to it. The fire of the Spirit is an image John especially cherished, not because of fire's destructive power, but because of its ability to purify. He described the process of purification as throwing a piece of wood into a furnace. At first, the fire burns away the impurities, cracking the wood, making it hiss and release smoke. As the fire enters more deeply, the wood begins to glow, and at last, the wood and the fire merge. Spiritual purification is the same. The soul undergoes the initial pain of being separated from attachments, then gradually becomes illuminated, and finally reaches union with God. This is not the work of reason but of love, a love guided by the Spirit and upheld by the 3 theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity. These virtues become the pillars that help the soul stand firm through trials. Faith to cling to God, hope to remain unbroken, and charity to overcome every temptation to abandon the chosen path. As he explored this spiritual dimension more deeply, John became freer to write. His great theological works were not the product of a cold, analytical mind, but the fragrance of a soul that had undergone a powerful encounter with God. The dark night emerged as a call inviting the soul to enter the journey of purification, not with fear, but with trust. The Ascent of Mount Carmel was written as a spiritual map outlining the path one must travel to reach Christian perfection. He described Mount Carmel not as a geographical place, but as a symbol of perfection, where the soul draws near to God in the emptiness of all attachments. Alongside these, the living flame of love is the song of a soul that has completed the journey of purification and reached final union, where the soul and God live in a single rhythm of perfect love. The spiritual canticle is a dialogue between the soul and the divine lover, expressing the soul's burning longing to meet the one who has conquered it. Together, these works form a mystical treasury of the Church, supporting countless souls through trials and guiding them to God by the path of deep silence. These works were not written only for monks, for John always believed that God invites every person to enter a path of purification in their own way. The night may come through suffering, illness, dryness in prayer, or the experience of great loss. Yet in every circumstance, God is there, working to transform the soul into a clear mirror reflecting His love. And when these great works had taken shape, God still had further trials awaiting John, trials not tied to shackles or prisons, but arising from leadership responsibilities and the pressures of community life. A mystic does not live only in books. The Reform continued to face turmoil, and John had to enter a stage where grace took the form of humble service. That path would lead him into the next chapter, where testing would take on a new form, more subtle yet no less profound. Why are those chosen by God so often misunderstood by their own community? This question echoes through the centuries and becomes clearer when we look at the period after Toledo in the life of John of the Cross. If the previous chapters portrayed a man purified through suffering to reach inner light, this chapter opens onto another trial, subtler and more painful, a trial coming from those who shared his ideals, from the very community to which John had devoted all his strength. After escaping from the Toledo prison and recovering in the Carmelite nuns' monastery, John did not withdraw into a hidden life, but entered a new season of service. The Carmelite reform was spreading and needed capable guides. John became one of its spiritual pillars and was entrusted with important responsibilities in the order. At first, his appointment to new tasks was greeted with respect, for everyone saw in him a deeply purified life and a steady spirit of prayer. Yet, as the reform increasingly affected the structure and the life of the order, tensions began to appear. Not all friars were ready to accept the demands of returning to the source of the rule. Some feared that the ascetic lifestyle would be too harsh. Others were afraid of losing the comforts they had grown accustomed to in the monastery. These feelings accumulated and gradually turned into opposition toward those leading the reform, including John. In that context, the hope for quick agreement faded. Rumors began to spread. Some said John was too strict. Others claimed he idealized the spiritual life too much. Some believed he was unsuited for administrative roles because of his quiet nature. Little by little, these voices formed a wall of separation between him and several brothers in the order. Though entrusted with important positions, John could not avoid isolation. At one point, he was removed from a responsibility he had been carrying, a pain no less sharp than the blows he suffered in Toledo. What makes one reflect is not that John endured opposition, but how he responded to it. He could have defended himself, justified himself, or proved that the accusations lacked fairness. But John chose another path, the path of silence. He faced the storm with the humility shaped through many years of clinging to the cross. For John, personal honor was not something to be defended at all costs. The only thing that mattered was fidelity to God and to the vocation he had received. In that silence, a new grace unfolded. John did not let his heart be disturbed by criticism. He viewed the internal conflicts of the order as part of the purification God continued to work in him. By accepting misunderstandings, John entered a deeper level of surrender. Without defending himself, without seeking support from those who sympathized with him, he chose to be the smallest one, a quiet servant even when stripped of leadership roles. At times, John had to leave familiar positions and live in small, humble monasteries. But precisely there, his soul was held by the gentle presence of the Spirit. Something unusual happened amid these misunderstandings. When John was pushed aside, when his name was no longer mentioned in important meetings, more friars came to him than ever. They did not come to learn administration but to receive spiritual guidance. They recognized in John a profound inner life and a gentleness capable of touching their hidden wounds. His silence did not make him distant. It made him a refuge for souls seeking God in religious life. John did not govern outwardly, but he became a true leader, one able to guide through the light and holiness of life. Although he never publicly addressed the trials he endured, John continued contributing to the reform. His influence expanded not through power, but through the radiant presence of someone who had passed through trials and still maintained inner joy. It was this perseverance that led the Carmelite reform to be gradually recognized legally and eventually accepted as an official part of the Church's life. Looking back, one can see John's imprint on every step of the reform, the imprint of someone who proclaimed renewal not with strong words, but with a life steeped in the Spirit's light. In his final years, John was no longer at the center of important decisions. He stepped back, not because of failure, but because his soul had reached a new level of union with God. He understood that every work, however great, must be returned to the one who began it. That silence made even clearer the bond uniting John with God, a bond woven through trials, sacrifice, and unwavering trust. But the earthly journey must eventually reach its end. The trials of community life seemed only the final preparation for God to bring John's flame into its moment of completion. After long years of labor, the time came for his inner light to dissolve into eternal light. And that would be the next chapter of the spiritual journey, where John entered his final moment with the serene beauty of a soul that had allowed itself to belong entirely to God. What allows a dying man to say, "Today I will chant the office in heaven"? That statement is not an empty comfort for those left behind, nor a forced effort to hide fear. It is a simple yet deeply truthful declaration. The declaration of a soul that has completed the path of purification, has passed through the depths of darkness and light, and has allowed the love of God to burn away every final barrier. John of the Cross entered the last days of his life, not with the fear of one who has not loved enough, but with the peace of one who has let himself be loved completely by God. In 1591, when the Reformed Carmelite Order had made stable progress, John was asked to transfer to a community in Mexico to continue supporting religious life. This was an honorable mission, but his health could no longer sustain it. Years of austerity, long periods of trial, and the physical and spiritual ordeals of the Toledo prison had left many marks. As preparations for the long sea voyage were underway, his illness suddenly worsened. The brothers realized John could not continue, forcing him to abandon the plan and retire to a modest monastery near Jaén to rest. There, John's body slowly gave way. Prolonged fevers, old wounds flaring, and sleepless nights drained his strength. He had to face physical pain at a level few could bear. But his trial did not end with bodily suffering. Some brothers, due to misunderstanding or reluctance to embrace the spirit of the reform, still looked at John with hesitation and at times did not offer him the sympathy he deserved. Strangely, someone who had spent so many years in service was met with suspicion in his weakest hour. Yet what was stranger still was how John received all this. He did not resent or brood over it. He saw it as the final portion of the journey of the cross God had prepared for him. From Toledo to Jaén, from lashes to illness, from misunderstanding to the solitude of his final days, every experience became for him a ladder drawing the soul closer to God. Those who cared for him recalled that he always kept a gentle smile, even in pain. When asked whether he wanted relief or a change of surroundings, he simply replied that the only thing he desired was for God to do whatever he wished. In his final days, John's peace was not the peace of resignation, but the peace of someone who had glimpsed eternal light. He welcomed each pain as the last notes of the love song he had sung all his life. In prayer, his heart melted into unity with God. Those who stayed by his bedside said his face seemed to shine, as if another world were opening before him. On his last night, as the brothers prayed, John opened his eyes, looked at those beside him, and said softly, "I am about to chant the office in heaven." Those words did not weigh on those who heard them, but filled them with a strange peace. They felt that John had truly been called home. There was no panic, no clinging, only the radiance of a soul that had reached the final summit of the spiritual journey. Between the night of December 13 and the early morning of the 14th of December 1591, John breathed his last. The brothers at his bedside described the moment as a small flame being drawn into eternity, not extinguished, but transformed into a greater light. His body was taken to Segovia, where he had once served, and the place later became a pilgrimage site for those seeking spiritual strength. But John's journey did not end with death. God kept that flame burning in the church through the honors bestowed across the centuries. In 1675, he was beatified. In 1726, he was canonized, and in 1926, Pope Pius XI declared him a Doctor of the Church with the title Doctor Mysticus, meaning mystical doctor. That title not only honored him as a theologian, but also affirmed that his life is a model for anyone longing to enter the depths of God. The legacy John left is not grand monuments or events of worldly acclaim, but a spiritual map guiding the soul to union with the Trinity. Works such as The Dark Night, The Ascent of Mount Carmel, The Living Flame of Love, and The Spiritual Canticle have become compasses for those facing trials, searching for meaning or yearning for a deeper relationship with God. These writings support countless souls in their long nights, helping them recognize that darkness is not an end, but a doorway to pure light. Looking back at the entire journey of John of the Cross, we see a flame that began in poverty at Fontiveros, passed through trial in Salamanca, was forged in the Toledo prison, blazed in his mystical writings, and finally merged into eternal light. That life is not measured by outward success, but by the depth of union with God. And now, his journey is not only remembered but continued in prayer, in quiet inner guidance, and in the souls who follow him in search of light amid the nights of their age. O God, Father of light, in the silent moment when the journey of St. John of the Cross has just closed before our eyes, my heart lifts to you a sincere prayer. The life of this saint, from the poor childhood days in Fontiveros to the prison of Toledo, from the writings steeped in the spirit to the peaceful passing in Jaén, has become a mirror for the paths we walk. He lived the journey of the dark night and ascended Mount Carmel through his own life, leaving us not only books, but a roadmap for encountering God in the depths of the soul. Now, as we turn our hearts toward that life, we recognize that the longing for God cannot grow without passing through purification and quiet trials. Therefore, with the humility of those who are still weak, we offer the first prayer. Lord, grant us the grace to enter the holy dark night with a spirit of surrender. Help us receive the events that shake the soul as part of your loving plan. When dryness in prayer stretches on, when trials in family life and community leave the mind unsettled, help us not to give up. In each moment, grant us strength so our hearts may remain faithful, so we know that darkness is not a meaningless emptiness, but a thin veil hiding the light that is rising from within. But darkness is not the end. O Holy Spirit, the flame that never dies, set our souls ablaze with the same fire that transformed John into a man of the dark night and of light. Grant us the grace of inner transformation, the grace to break the small attachments that bind our hearts to fleeting things. May every desire, every thought, every choice be illumined and purified by that fire. When our own will rises, grant us the courage to unite it with yours, so that in the smallest acts of daily life we may simply say, "May your will be done." O Jesus, the way, the truth, and the life, we also offer you a prayer for the Church, which holds within itself many souls walking through long nights of trial. Look with kindness upon the priests and religious who bear heavy responsibilities in these turbulent times. When they are misunderstood or opposed, when they face solitude no one understands, strengthen them with the same power that once sustained John of the Cross. Guard their hearts from discouragement, so they may always find joy in service and fidelity to the mission they have received. We also pray for those living in the darkness of abandonment, of lingering wounds, of hidden suffering. Lord, come to them with the same tenderness with which you came to John in that dark prison cell long ago. Touch them with the light that helps them understand that God is never absent. Even when they cannot feel you, grant them the certainty that you are at work in silence, bringing them to freedom, to peace, and to perfect love. And now, standing before the shining example of Saint John of the Cross, we offer you one final prayer. Grant that we may cling to God as he did, with a bond not based on fleeting emotions but on absolute trust. Help us offer ourselves each day, live with simplicity and purity, and become small instruments in God's hands. As we step into the world, let us carry the light you have kindled within us, a light able to soothe pain, dispel doubt, and lift weary souls. O God of love, receive this prayer and lead us into the depths of the Trinity as you led John. Let the flame within us never die but burn brightly as a sign of hope in a fragile world. And when our life's journey draws to its close, grant that we too may say with all our heart, I am about to sing in heaven the hymn of perfect joy in eternal union with God. I bless all of you who have liked this video. May God, through the intercession of the saints, grant you peace, health, and abundant grace in your life. Return to the tabernacle, return to the light of the Eucharist, return to the silent companionship of the one who awaits us in the sacrament of love. And if in what I have shared today you found even one or two lines that touched your soul and brought you closer to God, then I am already fulfilled.